My name's Mark Carter, and I've lived in a small, seemingly perfect suburban neighborhood for over 15 years. When I moved here with my wife, Emily, and our 2 kids, it was everything we dreamed of: peaceful, safe, and quiet. The kind of place where neighbors greeted each other on the street, and kids played in the yard without a care in the world. Everyone took pride in their homes, maintaining their lawns and gardens with meticulous care. And there was an unspoken rule that if you needed help, someone would always be there. It wasn't an overly affluent area, but it had character: tree-lined streets, houses with cozy porches, and a sense of community that made it feel like home. We had a neighbor who had lived here for decades, another young couple like us, and even a retired Army veteran who would wave to us as he worked in his yard every day. The kind of neighborhood where everyone was looking out for each other, but without stepping on each other's toes. Everything seemed perfect, at least at first. The change started subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it quickly grew into something unmanageable. It all began when the idea of an official homeowners association, HOA, was floated at a neighborhood meeting. I remember sitting in the back of the room as the proposal was discussed, nodding politely, thinking it was just another routine formality. At the time, I didn't mind the idea of an HOA. It seemed like a good way to keep the neighborhood nice and organized, some official oversight to ensure things didn't get out of hand. But like many people, I was naive. I had no idea that this HOA would eventually turn into a monstrous machine that would wreak havoc on my life. Karen Winters, the woman who would eventually become the president of the HOA, was a force of nature. She was well-spoken and seemed to have an aura of authority that drew people in. When she first moved into the neighborhood, she had a few brief conversations with us. Her charm was undeniable. Always smiling, always offering help with whatever you needed. She seemed like just another friendly neighbor. But soon, as she became more involved with the community, I started to notice something different. She had a sharp, calculating way about her that wasn't immediately apparent. It was almost as if Karen thought she was destined for something greater than just living in this sleepy little suburb. She didn't just want to be part of the community. She wanted to be in control of it. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just another case of someone getting excited about a new role. But when she was voted into the position of HOA president, things took a darker turn. The first few months after Karen took office were relatively uneventful. The neighborhood seemed to settle into its new routine. At first, I thought it would be business as usual, regular meetings, a few minor changes to improve the community, maybe even some social gatherings. It all seemed harmless. I didn't realize then that under Karen's leadership, business as usual would soon become something far more insidious. It started with small things. A newsletter appeared in my mailbox one morning, outlining the new community standards that we all needed to follow. I glanced over it briefly. Rules about maintaining lawn aesthetics, approved colors for fences, mailbox designs, even guidelines on the shape of bushes. I thought it was a little much, but I shrugged it off. I've always kept my lawn tidy, my fence in good shape. It seemed reasonable at the time, but the more I read, the more I started to see the cracks. The list of rules was longer than I expected, and some of them seemed absurd. For example, any outdoor decorations that didn't adhere to a specific color palette had to be removed. No exceptions. Christmas lights were only permitted between November 15 and December 31. No earlier, no later. And don't get me started on the approved plants list. If you didn't have the right types of flowers in your garden, it was considered a violation of community harmony. But it wasn't just about keeping up appearances. It was about control. The HOA meetings became more frequent, and Karen's influence over them grew stronger. I found out that she wasn't just making suggestions. She was creating rules, some of which had no logical basis. She started pushing for fines, small fines at first, but they were creeping higher, more frequent. A slight imperfection on your lawn, fine. Too many leaves in your yard, fine. Even parking in front of your house for more than 48 hours, fine. The first time I got a notice, I thought it was a mistake. I'd recently planted a few decorative rocks around the front walkway, just to make the entrance look a little more inviting. I'd always admired the way it looked in other neighborhoods. It was tasteful, nothing too extravagant. But according to the HOA, it was non-compliant. The letter said my rock decorations violated the HOA's guidelines on unapproved landscaping elements. They gave me 10 days to remove them or face a fine. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. The rocks? Really? I called the number on the letter, hoping to clear up what seemed like a misunderstanding. When I got Karen on the line, she didn't apologize or explain. Her tone was cold, almost condescending. The rules are clear, Mark. We expect everyone to comply. If you're not willing to follow the guidelines, you'll face a fine. It's simple. That's when I realized this wasn't about maintaining a nice neighborhood anymore. This was about power. Karen wasn't interested in friendly reminders or cooperation. She was enforcing her vision, her rules, on everyone. I took the rocks down, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. If Karen and the HOA were going to start policing every little detail of our lives, I had a feeling things were going to get much worse before they got better. Little did I know just how bad it would get. It didn't take long for the HOA's hold on the neighborhood to tighten further. After my rock incident, I thought things might settle down, but I was wrong. The rules became stricter and the fines more frequent. As the weeks went by, I started receiving more and more notices, each one more absurd than the last. The first warning came for something as simple as the color of my mailbox. It was a dark brown, one I had picked out myself when we first moved in. It matched the trim of the house, and I thought it was perfect for our modest home. But to the HOA, it was a problem. Apparently, there was an approved color palette for all mailboxes in the neighborhood, and dark brown wasn't one of the sanctioned colors. No exceptions. I was dumbfounded. The mailbox was functional, clean, and unobtrusive. It didn't stick out like a sore thumb or clash with the surroundings. But to Karen and the HOA, it was a violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic. They gave me 15 days to repaint it to an approved color. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a command. I felt a sense of powerlessness wash over me, but I wasn't the type to back down easily. I tried reasoning with Karen, hoping that if I explained how trivial the issue was, she might understand. I called her one evening, hoping to get through to her on a personal level. Karen, I don't understand the issue, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The mailbox isn't hurting anyone. It's not out of place. It's just a mailbox. She didn't even let me finish my sentence. Mark, you need to understand something, she replied, her voice colder than usual. This isn't about what you think looks good. It's about maintaining uniformity and order. You're not above the community standards, and that mailbox, whether you think it's fine or not, violates those standards. We've had complaints about the color, and you need to make the necessary changes. I couldn't believe it. Complaints? From who? Nobody had mentioned anything about the mailbox before, and I hadn't noticed anyone else's mailbox being scrutinized. Karen, this is getting out of hand. I tried to explain, frustration creeping into my voice. There are much bigger things to focus on than the color of a mailbox. But Karen was unmoved. You're welcome to live by your own rules in another neighborhood if this one doesn't suit you, Mark. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about control, Karen's control. She wasn't interested in the community's well-being. She was interested in forcing everyone to comply with her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. I decided to comply, of course, since the last thing I wanted was a fine. But the more I thought about it, the more angry and helpless I felt. It wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about the principle, and it seemed like Karen was just getting started. The next infraction came when I received a letter warning me that my lawn wasn't up to the HOA's standards. The notice said that I hadn't mowed sufficiently, and that the grass was growing too tall. To be clear, I had mowed the lawn just 2 days before the notice was sent. I walked outside to inspect the yard, and there was nothing wrong with it. Sure, there were a few stray weeds that had popped up along the edge of the driveway, but the grass itself was neat and green, just as it had been all season. But the HOA didn't care. Their notice insisted that the grass be cut to a specific height, even though it was already within reason. They sent a follow-up letter threatening a fine if I didn't comply within 48 hours. I was fuming. This was getting ridiculous. How could they enforce something as arbitrary as the height of my grass? This time, I decided to fight back. I went over to talk to Karen in person, hoping that a direct conversation might clear things up. "Karen, I got the letter about my lawn," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I just mowed it. It's not perfect, but it's well within the standards. I've been living here for over a decade, and I've never received a single complaint before." She barely looked up from the paperwork on her desk. "Your lawn is not up to par, Mark. If you want to continue living here, you need to adhere to the standards we've put in place. It's that simple." I shook my head. "But this is ridiculous. No one's even complained about my lawn before. It's always looked fine." Karen's eyes finally met mine, and her expression was cold. "I'm not interested in excuses, Mark. If you don't fix the issue, the fine will stand, and next time, it'll be higher." I was speechless. The HOA wasn't just punishing me for the grass. It was punishing me for daring to question them. I walked away, knowing that any argument I made would be futile. A few days later, my neighbor Tom, who had lived here even longer than I had, stopped by. He had his own bone to pick with the HOA, and I could tell by the way he was walking that he was just as frustrated as I was. "Mark, this is getting out of hand," he said as soon as I opened the door. "They've fined me twice this month, once for my hedge height and once for overgrown vines. They're making up rules just to punish us." Tom had always been one of those neighbors who kept to himself, never getting involved in the drama. But now he was boiling over. "I've had it," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not putting up with this anymore. We need to do something about it." I was surprised by how passionately he spoke. I've been thinking the same thing. The more I try to comply, the more they find to complain about. It's like we're being targeted. Tom nodded. "Exactly. And I'm sick of it. They've got to be stopped." That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone in this. Tom was ready to fight, and if we could unite, maybe we could finally stand up to Karen and her HOA. Little did we know, this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would escalate far beyond just fines and letters. As I stood there, listening to Tom vent about his own issues with the HOA, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could take this fight back to them. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA was a machine, a well-oiled, organized force with a single-minded goal: control. But if they wanted a fight, I was more than ready to give them one. The tension between me and the HOA continued to build. It wasn't just about the lawn or the mailbox anymore. It was about the very principle of what the HOA was trying to do: stifle individuality, crush any semblance of personal freedom, and impose their rigid, arbitrary rules on every homeowner in the neighborhood. The more I resisted, the more they came after me, with Karen at the helm, dictating every move. It was clear that this wasn't a small issue anymore. The HOA had become a power-hungry entity, and I was caught in its crossfire. It started with another fine, a fine for a minor infraction that, in any rational world, would have been laughable. Apparently, I had let my trash cans sit out on the curb for too long. The trash pickup had been delayed due to a city-wide issue, and I hadn't brought the cans back inside the garage immediately after collection. They had been sitting there for a day, but to the HOA, this was an offense that required a $50 fine. It wasn't about the trash cans. I knew that. It was about control. I had crossed a line in their eyes, and they were going to punish me for it, no matter how small or insignificant the infraction. I considered ignoring it, letting the fine stack up, but I knew that would just give them more ammunition to escalate things even further. Karen didn't stop there. She began ramping up the enforcement of the rules across the board. She would send out letters to almost every house detailing minor infractions, some of which had never even been an issue before. Neighbors were being fined for things like failing to trim their trees or cluttering the yard with children's toys, even when it was obvious that the complaints were fabricated or taken out of context. The HOA, it seemed, was on a mission to exert total dominance over our lives. At first, I tried talking to some of the other homeowners, hoping to rally support, but many of them were too scared to speak up. They didn't want to risk facing fines or retaliation. The fear that Karen had instilled in the neighborhood was palpable. People were beginning to avoid eye contact at the grocery store, hesitant to even speak about the HOA in public. I spoke to Tom more frequently, and I could see the same frustration building in him. He had been slapped with several fines recently, one for a lawn color inconsistency. His grass had been slightly different shades due to overwatering, and another for unapproved fence decoration. His kids had hung a few simple birdhouses on their fence. He was at his wit's end, and I knew we both needed to take action before things got out of hand. We began brainstorming. I pulled out my legal research materials and started digging into the HOA bylaws. Surely there had to be something we could use against them. I also consulted an attorney friend of mine who specialized in real estate law. He cautioned me against doing anything rash, but said there might be a case to be made about the HOA's overreach if we could prove that their actions were unreasonable or discriminatory. But the lawyer also warned that going to court would be a long, expensive battle. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. The HOA wasn't just being unreasonable. They were actively harassing people, forcing them into submission through fear of fines, legal action, and the constant threat of compliance. They were ruining the very fabric of the community that had once been so welcoming and peaceful. I started documenting everything. Every fine, every letter, every conversation with Karen and the board members. I knew I had to build a solid case, but I also knew I wasn't the only one who was fed up. More and more neighbors started speaking up, albeit quietly. Some even started sharing their own experiences with the HOA's unreasonable behavior. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing my notes, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it was a warning that my garage was too cluttered and that it violated community guidelines for maintaining an orderly exterior. The letter threatened further fines and potential legal action if I didn't immediately clear the area. I stared at the letter in disbelief. My garage had a few boxes in it, nothing excessive, certainly nothing that would be visible from the street, but Karen's HOA had somehow turned the concept of orderly into a rigid standard that no one could meet without fear of punishment. That was it. I'd had enough. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to live in a community where the HOA could dictate every aspect of my life, from the grass on my lawn to the contents of my garage. I had to make them understand that they could not continue like this without facing consequences. The next step was simple. I needed allies. I wasn't going to fight this fight alone. Tom was on board, and he wasn't the only one. More and more neighbors came forward, sharing stories about the fines and harassment they'd experienced. Some had even received fines for things that weren't even mentioned in the bylaws. One neighbor was fined for having a slightly chipped mailbox, while another had been hit with a penalty because her front porch light was too bright. The stories kept piling up, and each new revelation only added fuel to the fire. We decided to create a group, an unofficial coalition of homeowners who were sick of the HOA's overreach. The group was made up of mostly longtime residents who had witnessed the gradual decline of the neighborhood's once charming atmosphere under Karen's rule. We met in secret, at first, in people's living rooms or backyards, sharing our frustrations and brainstorming ways to fight back. But I knew that going up against the HOA would be no easy task. Karen wasn't going to back down. She was too entrenched in her position, too invested in her vision of control. If we wanted to beat her, we had to be strategic, and we had to do it legally. I consulted my lawyer friend again. He advised me to gather as much evidence as possible, then consider filing a formal complaint with the local government, citing the HOA's overreach and possible violations of homeowners' rights. But there was something else I had in mind, something that would shake the HOA to its core. I needed to expose Karen. I needed to show everyone that she wasn't just an overly strict HOA president. She was a corrupt individual who had used her position for personal gain. I began digging into her background, looking for any signs of misconduct or conflicts of interest. What I found would be the key to bringing her down. The war had officially begun. With the support of my neighbors, I was ready to take on the HOA, no longer just to defend my home, but to free my entire neighborhood from the grip of an oppressive, power-hungry regime. The stakes were higher than I ever anticipated, and I had no idea how much further this conflict would escalate, but I was prepared for whatever came next. The HOA had underestimated me, and they were about to pay the price. I had spent months quietly gathering evidence, talking to neighbors, and learning the ins and outs of HOA regulations. I was ready. I wasn't going to let Karen Winters and her overbearing HOA crush this neighborhood any longer. But the HOA, in their typical heavy-handed fashion, didn't give me much time to plan. They escalated their actions without warning, pushing me to a breaking point I hadn't anticipated. It all started one Thursday morning. I woke up to find a notice slip under my front door. At first, I thought it was just another fine for something minor. Maybe the grass had grown a bit longer than it should have, or perhaps a neighbor had complained about the slight discoloration on the side of my fence. But as I opened the letter and read through it, I felt my blood run cold. The HOA was threatening to foreclose on my home. The letter detailed multiple infractions and unpaid fines. The worst part, there were fines listed that I had never even received. The letter claimed I had accumulated thousands of dollars in penalties. There was no mention of the initial fines I'd paid or the disputes I had raised with Karen. It was as if all the attempts I had made to comply, bringing my garage into order, repainting the mailbox, even keeping up with the lawn, had been ignored. Worse yet, they said that my non-compliance had led to irreparable damage to the neighborhood's value, and therefore, foreclosure proceedings would begin if I didn't pay the fines immediately. I couldn't breathe. This was no longer about petty rules or ridiculous guidelines. This was their way of eliminating anyone who dared challenge their authority. They had crossed a line, and I knew it was time to fight back with everything I had. But first, I needed to calm down. I couldn't let anger cloud my judgment. I called my lawyer, and after a tense conversation, he advised me to pay the fines while we worked on a more thorough legal challenge. But that wasn't enough for me. I knew that paying off these fines would only mean more fines in the future, and I was tired of constantly being bullied. I went outside and stood in my yard, staring at the house I'd worked so hard for, the house I'd raised my kids in, where Emily and I had spent countless nights planning our future. The thought of losing it over something so trivial, over something that wasn't even my fault, was unbearable. That's when I made up my mind. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to destroy the HOA. I started contacting more of my neighbors. I wasn't sure who could help me, but I knew I couldn't take this fight on alone anymore. Tom, my old friend, was the first to show up. He had been hit with a similar threat to foreclosure, and I could see the frustration etched on his face as he read the letter I had received. "We need to take action now," he said, his voice low and serious. "They're trying to break us, Mark. This has gone too far." I nodded. Tom wasn't the only one who had been dealing with overzealous fines. A few other neighbors had started receiving the same notices, all claiming astronomical fines for minor violations. Karen's HOA wasn't just punishing us. It was trying to intimidate us into submission. One neighbor, Steve, had received a letter claiming he hadn't cleared his driveway after a snowstorm, even though he had. Another neighbor, Carol, had been fined for excessive vegetation in her garden, even though she had maintained it in accordance with HOA rules. The fines were piling up, and it was clear that Karen was trying to break us all down one by one. But we weren't going to let that happen. I gathered everyone I could find, neighbors, friends, even a few people who had been too scared to speak out before. I told them we were going to take this to the next level. We weren't going to stand idly by while our homes were threatened, and we weren't going to let Karen get away with what she had been doing for years. The group we formed wasn't huge, but it was strong. We made plans to attend the next HOA board meeting. We would all be there, and we would make our voices heard. But before we could do that, I needed to get more concrete evidence. I couldn't just show up at the meeting and yell. I needed the truth to back me up. That's when I decided to dig deeper into Karen's past. I had already suspected that Karen wasn't as clean as she appeared. She had always projected an air of authority, and I had noticed her tendency to push through whatever rules suited her personal agenda. So I started looking into her background, pulling up public records, and even asking around. It didn't take long to find some disturbing information. Karen Winters had been involved in several small legal battles in the past, many of them related to property disputes and unethical business practices. There were whispers in the community about her family's connection to local real estate ventures, and I started to connect the dots. It became clear to me that Karen's HOA wasn't just a community organization. It was a way for her to exert control over valuable property, increase her influence, and possibly even profit from the chaos she was creating. One incident caught my attention: a report from a local news outlet about a property dispute involving Karen and another homeowner. In that case, she had allegedly used her position as HOA president to bully the homeowner into selling their property below market value. It wasn't clear whether any money had changed hands, but it was enough to raise a red flag. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was exploiting her position for personal gain. I knew this was the key to breaking the HOA's grip on the neighborhood. If we could prove that Karen was using the HOA to manipulate property values for her own benefit, we would have the ammunition to expose her and shut her down for good. I met with Tom, Steve, and Carol late that night, and we began drafting a plan. We needed to present everything: the fines, the foreclosure threats, the questionable practices, and Karen's suspicious history. We would expose the HOA's corruption in front of the entire community. We would stand together and make it clear that we weren't going to be intimidated any longer. The next HOA meeting was only a week away, and I knew it would be the perfect opportunity to confront Karen. But as the day approached, the weight of what we were about to do began to settle in. We weren't just fighting to stop a few fines. We were going after someone who had systematically destroyed this neighborhood with her greed and control. If we didn't win, it could mean the end of everything we had worked for. But I couldn't back down now. We couldn't afford to lose. It was all or nothing. And as I walked toward that HOA meeting, I knew that I wasn't just fighting for my home. I was fighting for every homeowner who had been silenced, for every neighbor who had been too scared to speak out, and for the future of this community. It was time to take down Karen Winters and the corrupt HOA that had been terrorizing us for far too long. The night before the HOA meeting, I hardly slept. My mind raced with the possibilities of what might happen. The plans were set. Tom, Steve, Carol, and I would show up together. We had gathered all the evidence: each fine, each threatening letter, each unlawful foreclosure notice, and most importantly, the information I had dug up on Karen Winters. We were ready to expose the corruption, to show the community that Karen wasn't some well-meaning, upstanding HOA president. She was a power-hungry, manipulative individual who was exploiting her position for personal gain. When the meeting finally arrived, my nerves were shot. I wasn't the type to stand up in front of large groups, especially when the stakes were this high. But this time, I knew I had no choice. This wasn't just for me. It was for every homeowner who had been silenced by Karen and her cronies. This was our chance to make our voices heard. The HOA meeting took place in the community center, a small, sterile room with faded carpet and too many chairs lined up in rows. It was the same place where they held community events and where Karen and her fellow board members held their monthly meetings to discuss, and often enforce, their tyrannical rules. When we arrived, I noticed that the room was already filled with homeowners, most of whom I'd never seen at an HOA meeting before. These weren't the usual timid residents who quietly tolerated the oppressive rules. These were the people who had had enough, and they were ready to fight back. The fear that had once gripped the community had started to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of unity and resolve. Karen was sitting at the front of the room, behind the large wooden table where she conducted the meetings like a judge presiding over a court. She glanced up as we entered, her sharp eyes narrowing when she saw us walking in with a group of people who were obviously not regulars. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked to the front of the room, and I steeled myself for what was to come. Tom and the others joined me at the front, and we took our seats. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing on me. This wasn't just another complaint about a mailbox or a lawn. This was about standing up to a system that had oppressed us for too long. The meeting started, and Karen went through the usual agenda, outlining new rules and regulations, offering the same tired justifications for why everything had to be uniform and orderly. I could see her glancing at the clock, trying to rush through the formalities, eager to get to the end of the meeting and avoid any challenges to her authority. But I wasn't going to let her off that easy. After a few minutes, I stood up. The room went silent. All eyes turned toward me. "Excuse me, Karen," I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice trembled slightly with nerves. "I have something I'd like to address." Karen's face darkened as I spoke. "Mark, I don't think this is the appropriate time for personal grievances. This is a formal meeting." "I think you'll find this is very much a community issue," I replied, my voice steadying as I continued. "A serious issue that has affected all of us, not just me." I glanced around the room. The faces staring back at me were a mix of frustration, confusion, and curiosity. People were beginning to realize that something bigger was at play. I could see it in their eyes. This wasn't just about a few fines anymore. It was about the larger problem Karen had been creating in our neighborhood. "I've been receiving these fines for months," I continued, "and I've complied with every demand. I repainted my mailbox. I mowed my lawn according to your specifications, and I've even cleared my garage as instructed. And yet, I receive another letter this morning, a threat of foreclosure." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some of the more vocal homeowners were nodding, their frustration bubbling to the surface. "You can't just keep imposing fines and threatening foreclosure when there's no legal basis for it," I said, holding up the letter. "You can't just pick and choose who you target. We're all being punished for no reason." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but she didn't speak. I took that as a sign to continue. "I've been doing my research, Karen," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I've looked into the HOA's own rules, and I've found several inconsistencies in how they're being enforced. You've created rules that don't even exist in the bylaws. You're fining us for things that have no basis in the guidelines, and you're using these fines to intimidate homeowners into submission. But it doesn't stop there, does it?" The room was completely silent now. The crowd was hanging on every word. "Karen, I've also looked into you," I continued, my tone hardening. "I found that you've been involved in property disputes and legal battles where you've used your position as HOA president to bully homeowners into selling their properties. You've manipulated your power for personal gain, and we have the proof to show it." Karen's face turned pale as I laid out the evidence, details of her past legal battles, her questionable property dealings, and the real estate connections that had benefited her personally. It was like I had thrown a rock in a calm pond. The still waters shattered, and the ripples spread through the room. "This isn't just about petty fines anymore," I said, my voice rising as I spoke. "This is about corruption. This is about an HOA president who has used her position to manipulate the rules for her own benefit. And I'm not the only one who's been affected by this." A few people in the audience started speaking up. One woman, whom I recognized as Carol, stood and said, "It's true. I've been fined for things that don't even exist in the rules. This has gone on for too long." Another neighbor, Steve, added, "I've been fined for not clearing snow on my driveway, even though I did. And I'm not the only one. This has to stop." The tide was turning. The silence in the room was replaced by a chorus of voices. The momentum was shifting. Karen's grip on the HOA was slipping. Karen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is absurd," she shouted, trying to regain control of the meeting. "You can't just come in here and make baseless accusations. This is a community, and we have rules that need to be followed." "You've been breaking the rules, Karen," I countered, my voice unshaken, "and now the whole community knows about it." There was no turning back now. The cracks in Karen's facade were exposed, and the community was finally starting to see her for what she truly was. Karen tried to salvage the situation by quickly attempting to shut down the meeting, but it was too late. The damage had been done. People were no longer afraid. The tide had shifted, and they were ready to fight back. We had just begun the battle, but we were no longer fighting in the shadows. The truth was out, and there was no going back for Karen Winters or her corrupt HOA. The moment I finished speaking, the room erupted into chaos. Neighbors were talking over each other, demanding answers, sharing their own frustrations, and raising concerns about the HOA's practices. Karen stood at the front, fuming, her face flushed with anger. She tried to assert control, raising her hands to silence the crowd, but it was clear she had lost her grip. The HOA board members, who had remained quiet up to that point, looked equally uncomfortable. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact. Tom, Steve, and Carol, who had been standing behind me throughout my speech, began speaking up one by one, backing up my claims. Carol detailed how Karen had fined her for something as trivial as the color of her front door, which had been deemed out of compliance with the HOA's aesthetic standards. Steve shared his experience of receiving multiple fines for so-called unapproved improvements on his property, improvements that had been made with materials that had already been approved by the previous HOA president. It was clear to everyone that this was no longer just about one homeowner's grievances. It was about the systemic abuse of power by Karen and the HOA board. One neighbor, Mark, who had always been quiet and hesitant to get involved, finally spoke up. "You know, I thought I was the only one," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "I've been getting these fines too, and I thought it was just me. But I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one being harassed." The floodgates had opened. More homeowners, emboldened by the wave of support, began standing up to share their own experiences. Every story was the same: arbitrary fines, threats, and intimidation. It seemed like Karen and the board had been targeting anyone who dared to step out of line, using the HOA as a weapon to force compliance. The evidence was undeniable. Karen, realizing she had lost control, tried to quiet the crowd again, but this time no one listened. The board members exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. Finally, one of them, a man named Greg, who had always been more sympathetic to the homeowners, stood up. I think we need to pause this meeting," Greg said, his voice hesitant. "This isn't something that can be settled here today. We need to review everything and address these concerns properly. Let's reconvene in a week." Karen shot him a furious glare, but Greg stood his ground. She could feel her authority crumbling, and it was the first time in years that she had been put on the defensive. That night, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. We had shaken the foundations of the HOA, and Karen knew it. The silence that followed after the meeting was thick with tension. While the battle wasn't won yet, the tide had clearly turned. We had exposed the corruption, and the community was no longer afraid to speak up. The next few days were a blur as I continued to gather support, documenting everything, and preparing for what was to come. I reached out to my lawyer again, updating him on the progress. He was cautiously optimistic, but reminded me that Karen and the board would likely fight back hard. The power they had held for so long wasn't going to be relinquished easily. But now, with the evidence we had, and with the community rallying behind us, there was no way they could ignore the truth. As the week passed, we saw more and more signs of resistance from the HOA. Karen sent out an email to the homeowners trying to do damage control. She claimed that the meeting had been misunderstood and that there was no truth to the allegations against her. She even attempted to spin the situation as though the HOA was being attacked by a small group of disgruntled residents who were trying to disrupt the peaceful community. It was a desperate attempt to paint herself as the victim. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak out now felt empowered to voice their opinions. Some even sent emails to Karen and the board demanding a full audit of the HOA's financial records and decision-making processes. It was clear that the mood in the neighborhood had shifted. The more Karen tried to cover up the truth, the more people started to push back. The most telling sign that things were unraveling came when I received a call from Greg, the board member who had stood up to Karen during the meeting. "Mark," he said, his voice low, "I want to be clear about something. What's been going on here isn't right. I've been uncomfortable with Karen's approach for a while, but I never thought it had gotten this bad. I want to help you expose what's been happening. I'll support you through this." I was taken aback. I hadn't expected any board member to come forward, but Greg's words were a lifeline. If we had an insider on our side, It would give us the leverage we needed to push for real change. He continued, I've seen the records, the fines, the irregularities. It's all there. I'll do what I can to help, but we need to act fast. The longer this drags on, the harder it's going to be to make any real changes. That conversation solidified it for me. We had an ally inside the board, and with his help, we could make sure that Karen's reign of terror came to an end once and for all. As the week wore on, the HOA board was forced to schedule another meeting. This time, the community had a clear goal. We weren't just going to complain. We were going to demand change. Armed with new evidence, the support of our neighbors, and the promise of Greg's cooperation, we had a real shot at dismantling the corrupt system that had plagued us for so long. Karen and the board may have thought they could intimidate us into submission, but they were wrong. This fight was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning, and we were going to finish what we had started. The HOA would fall, and Karen would finally be held accountable for her actions. The next meeting would be the one where everything changed. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Monday evening, just days after the chaos of the last one. The anticipation in the neighborhood was palpable. Homeowners who had once stayed silent were now coming together in groups, chatting with one another, expressing their frustrations and strategizing how to proceed. The tide had turned, and no one was backing down now. I arrived at the community center early, as usual, but this time the parking lot was already full. The number of residents showing up was unlike any previous meeting I had attended. They weren't just sitting in the back, passively waiting for the meeting to end. No, they were standing in groups, exchanging stories, looking for answers, and plotting the next steps. For the first time in years, Karen's HOA was facing real opposition. As I walked into the building, I saw Karen standing at the front, flanked by her board members. Her expression was stern, but it was clear she was trying to hold on to whatever control she had left. She glanced at me as I walked in, and I couldn't help but notice the flicker of nervousness in her eyes. She knew the storm was coming. She knew her time as president was running out. The meeting started like every other one before it. Karen stood at the front, attempting to assert control over the room, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Every word she spoke was met with skeptical glances and low murmurs from the audience. The community was no longer listening to her with reverence. They were listening to her with distrust and disdain. Thank you all for coming, Karen began, her voice cold and stiff. As you all know, there have been some misunderstandings over the past few weeks, but I assure you, the HOA is doing everything in its power to maintain order and protect the property values in this neighborhood. I could see the frustration building in the crowd, and I knew it was time. I stood up, the silence in the room falling over us like a heavy blanket. All eyes turned toward me. Karen's gaze locked with mine, and I could see the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. Karen, I said, my voice clear and steady, I've had enough of your lies. We've all had enough. I paused for effect, letting the words sink in. The room was silent, waiting for me to continue. We've been subjected to arbitrary fines, empty threats, and intimidation tactics for far too long, I said. You have used your position as HOA president to bully residents, make unfair demands, and profit from your control over this neighborhood. But we're not backing down anymore. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. This was it, the moment when everything would change. I've done my homework, Karen, I continued. I've looked through the records. I've found the inconsistencies in your fines. I've found the evidence of your corruption. And I'm not the only one. Many of these people have been victimized by your tactics, and we're done being silent. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents, photocopies of emails, records of unfair fines, and details of Karen's past business dealings that had been concealed from the public. I could see the shock on her face as I passed the documents to the board members sitting at the front. You've been using the HOA to line your pockets, Karen, I said, my voice rising with conviction. You've manipulated the rules to benefit yourself and punish anyone who doesn't comply with your personal agenda. We have the proof, and we're not going to let you get away with it any longer. Karen's face was now a mask of fury, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She tried to speak, but I cut her off before she could even form words. "I have a witness here tonight," I said, turning toward the back of the room. "A board member who has seen everything firsthand and is willing to testify about the corruption within this HOA. Greg, if you could stand up and share what you know." Greg, the board member who had reached out to me earlier, stood up slowly. He looked nervous, but determined. He walked to the front of the room, standing beside me. The room was dead silent as he began to speak. "I've seen what's been going on behind closed doors," Greg said, his voice shaky but firm. "I've witnessed Karen's manipulation of the HOA rules. I've seen how she's used her position to force residents into compliance, regardless of whether the rules actually support it. And I've seen how she's made decisions that benefit herself, her friends, and her business associates, while punishing those who dare question her." The room erupted in whispers. People exchanged shocked glances. Some even gasped. It was clear that many had suspected something, but hearing it confirmed by someone inside the board was a game changer. Karen's mask of authority had finally cracked. Greg continued, detailing specific instances where Karen had used her influence to change rules, impose unfair fines, and even force homeowners to sell their properties below market value. He outlined the ways she had abused the HOA's power for personal gain. As he spoke, I could see Karen's composure slipping. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for any ally who might come to her defense, but none came. The atmosphere in the room shifted drastically. The board members, who had once stood by Karen, were now visibly uncomfortable. One by one, they began to look away, unwilling to make eye contact with her. The support she had enjoyed for so long was evaporating before her eyes. As Greg finished speaking, a few people in the crowd began to stand, applauding. It was a quiet, subdued applause, but it was enough to show Karen that the community was turning against her. The power she had wielded for years was slipping through her fingers. "I think it's time for you to step down, Karen," I said, my voice low but resolute. Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat. "You're all just a bunch of troublemakers." But her words fell flat. No one was listening anymore. The community had seen the truth, and the truth couldn't be ignored. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Karen's reign as HOA president was over. The next few hours felt like a blur. The rest of the meeting was spent discussing the immediate steps that needed to be taken to remove Karen from power. The board members who had supported her were either forced to resign or were quickly outvoted by the growing majority of homeowners who had had enough. Karen, unable to maintain her control, left the room in a storm of rage, her head held high in a last-ditch effort to save face. As I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by my neighbors, I realized that we had done it. The corrupt HOA was finally falling apart, and we had won. But the battle wasn't over yet. There would be consequences. Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight, and she wouldn't give up her position easily. But we had exposed her. We had shown the entire neighborhood that the HOA wasn't invincible. And now that the truth was out, there was no turning back. We had taken the first step toward reclaiming our homes and our community, and there was no way Karen, or anyone like her, was going to take it away from us. The dust settled quickly after that final, climactic meeting. Karen left in a huff, her dignity shattered, and the remaining board members, who had been her loyal supporters, followed suit. The silence in the room was deafening, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that only comes when a long, festering wound is finally exposed. There was a sense of relief in the air, a palpable shift. We had done it. The HOA was no longer in control. For the next several days, the neighborhood buzzed with news of what had happened. Word spread quickly, and soon, people who had been on the fence about speaking up were now rallying behind the cause. Some even showed up at my door, shaking my hand, thanking me for what we had done. For the first time in years, I felt like we were a community again, not just a group of isolated homeowners under the thumb of a tyrannical HOA. The next HOA meeting was set for the following week, and this time, the agenda was much different. Karen's removal from the board was discussed. along with the need for an overhaul of the HOA's practices. Greg, the board member who had helped expose Karen's corruption, was now the acting president. He wasted no time in setting the tone for what was to come. "We're going to start over," Greg said, addressing the group. "We will no longer tolerate the practices that have harmed this community for so long. There will be transparency, fairness, and accountability moving forward. We will revisit every fine, every violation notice, and we will correct the mistakes of the past." It was a promise many of us had never thought we would hear from an HOA president. There was something genuine in Greg's voice, a sense of responsibility that had been sorely lacking under Karen's reign. The new board members were elected, with a mixture of former critics of Karen and fresh faces from the community who were eager to see things change. One of the first actions taken was to appoint a third-party auditor to go over the HOA's financial records. We wanted to make sure there were no lingering secrets, no hidden agendas that might come back to bite us later. We had learned the hard way that transparency was key, and we weren't about to let history repeat itself. Karen, of course, wasn't going to take her downfall quietly. A few days after her ousting, I received a letter from her lawyer threatening a lawsuit, claiming defamation and wrongful termination. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to save face and, perhaps, to reclaim her power. Her lawyer cited the meetings where I'd spoken out against her and the evidence I had presented as false accusations and malicious attacks. But that didn't scare me. I wasn't worried about her empty threats anymore. She had shown her true colors, and now the community had seen it too. The HOA, in its current form, was already under new management. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. My lawyer, who had been a quiet supporter throughout this entire ordeal, assured me that there was nothing for us to fear. "She's just lashing out, trying to regain some semblance of control," he said. "But it's over. She's lost her credibility, and no one in this neighborhood is going to side with her now." Sure enough, after a few weeks of back-and-forth legal threats, Karen's lawyer dropped the case. It was clear she had no real grounds for a lawsuit, and even if she did, her reputation had been irreparably damaged. The community had spoken, and the HOA had changed. Karen's grip on power had slipped away, and there was no coming back for her. The real transformation, however, came in the way the neighborhood began to function. The once quiet, passive residents who had been living under the HOA's thumb were now actively participating in community decisions. Neighborhood watch programs were formed, social events were planned, and there was a renewed sense of togetherness. People who had once been fearful of the HOA were now excited to be involved in a positive, cooperative way. There were town hall meetings, discussions about potential improvements, and even debates on how to ensure the HOA would never again become a tool of oppression. Greg, as the new president, was a breath of fresh air. He listened to everyone, and instead of pushing through new rules that benefited a select few, he made sure that all voices were heard. The idea of fairness was no longer an afterthought. It was the core of everything the HOA did. The board took a much more community-oriented approach, ensuring that every homeowner had a say in decisions that affected them. And as for me, well, the satisfaction of knowing I'd helped bring about real change was more than enough. It wasn't just about defeating Karen. It was about reclaiming a sense of ownership over our community, about proving that even in the face of overwhelming power, ordinary people could make a difference. Months passed, and the HOA was finally functioning the way it should. There were still some growing pains, as there are with any big change, but the direction was clear. Karen may have been gone, but her legacy of corruption wasn't forgotten. We remained vigilant, ensuring that the new board upheld the promises they'd made. The final irony came when a few months after Karen's removal, I saw a for sale sign in front of her house. Apparently, her reputation had followed her even outside the community. The damage was done, and it wasn't just the HOA that had fallen apart. It was Karen's carefully constructed life of manipulation and control. No one was willing to buy into her perfect, pristine neighborhood anymore. In the end, she had lost everything: her power, her reputation, and, ultimately, her home. Looking back, it felt surreal. The community had come together to defeat an injustice, and in doing so we had proven that no one, not even a corrupt HOA president, could keep a good neighborhood down. The lessons we learned were hard, but they were necessary. We knew now that we had to stay vigilant, to continue fighting for what was right, and to never again let a small group of people take advantage of the many. The HOA had been bulldozed, but so had Karen's tyranny, and in the aftermath, a new era had begun, one where the community, not the HOA, was in charge. The homeowners had won, and for the first time in a long time, I truly felt like I was home.